You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Hello everyone, I'm Chris, and I have the bittersweet honor of welcoming you to a potentially grim, soul-crushing, and possibly controversial episode. As yes, we will look into the time-old question of whether or not we can truly separate the art from the artist. Is it even possible to do so? Can we erase what we know about their personal lives and beliefs when we see them on screen or engage with their work? But the debate goes much further than that. Listening to some of the discourse surrounding art and the artists that create it, especially from the last decade, this may not even be a question of how we interact with and consume film, music, books, and other art, but whether there are actually moral questions involved. Could it be that not only should we avoid separating the art from the artist, but that there is, in fact, immoral not to? That is it immoral to consume art from immoral artists? Are you actually supporting them, or worse, supporting their actions if you watch just one of their films? So that viewpoint can also be flipped, because is there problematic elements in that view in itself? Who decides where the line goes? And what does this kind of thinking do to how we interact with art? May we actually be losing something in the process? As always, we will attempt to be as nuanced as we can, but the temperature on this debate is already running quite high. So let me actually start with a very unusual opening question to each of my co-hosts. Do you actually feel comfortable discussing this subject?
Hi, I'm Matthieu. I feel quite comfortable talking about this subject. In fact, I kind of love talking about these kind of subjects. I think they're some of the most interesting issues we are facing precisely because they are kind of complex. And I generally think that talking about them directly, face to face, or I mean, in this case, not literally, but still close to it, is the best way to do it, rather than on stuff like Twitter, etc., where it's much harder to come to a common understanding, even if there is disagreement.
Hi, it's Sol from Australia. Yes, I feel comfortable talking about the subject, or talking to you guys, at least on the podcast, about it. With some people in real life, I might dance around a little bit and not make clear viewpoints, but I feel with the right people, you can have a frank and honest discussion about this.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, both of you. I don't think I feel uncomfortable talking about this because it is a very interesting topic, and as long as we can manage to be nuanced about it, there's just so much to unpack and bite into here. So with that out of the way, let's just take a really quick straw poll just to see where we are all coming from. Should we separate the art from the artist? You can do yes or no answers to that, or if you're somewhere in between, just try to quickly lay out your base position, and then we'll get into the details along the way.
Yeah, so at the risk of being a little boring, I'm going to say it depends. I think in general, my view is that we should take into account what consequences are of separating art from the artist or not doing so. And so when it comes to your personal consumption, I guess, watching a film, the consequence is not huge. But when it comes to other things, the consequences can be larger. So I think it depends on what it actually implies to do so.
So Chris said straw poll, short, sharp answer. My short, sharp answer is yes. We should always separate the artist from the art, but I can delve more into that later if people want.
Very good. So I guess I can reveal my answer too, which is a partial no, but not in the way you may expect. Because I do think that what the artist's personal beliefs and what their lives are should, at least in some way, change how we think about the work, as the artist is always part of the work. That doesn't necessarily mean I'll avoid their work, But I think it's at least an interesting tidbit to consider while watching a film, as it can add something extra to the experience. But to turn this towards not just this general question of separating art from the artist, because that's not really what people talk about when they talk about this question. They're talking about artists that have done something that they find morally apprehensible. Perhaps they've even done something that is criminal. So are there any directors or actors or anyone else involved in the film industry that you're actually avoiding due to their actions?
So this is a tougher question to answer than it seems. My first inclination would be to say no, because even someone like Roman Polanski, who is, I think, the most obvious example for me, when his latest film came in theaters, what I did is I bought a ticket for another film and went to see it anyway, which is, I guess we can discuss whether or not that works as an approach or not, but but then there's other cases where it's not so much about making a moral decision that I don't want to support this artist. It's more about being uncomfortable. When I watched Manhattan, the Woody Allen film, I don't know if Woody Allen has done anything wrong. Actually, I don't know the question well enough, but it certainly has some things that make me feel uncomfortable. And so I guess I have not been as enthusiastic about exploring his filmography because of that. But it's not like a conscious decision of, oh no, I don't want to see a film by him. And generally, I don't think if a film is something that I disagree with profoundly, like, I don't know, The Birth of a Nation, I don't think that means I shouldn't watch it. So again, I'm not answering yes or no.
So that's a very interesting answer about maybe going and purchasing a ticket to another film and going and seeing a Polanski film. But to me, I guess that doesn't make any sense at all, because the way that I look at movie making is that it's a collaborative process. And if there's one person involved who's done something maybe a bit unsavory or worse, it doesn't actually mean that everybody else should be penalized for that as such. So I'm thinking about sort of things like American Beauty. Okay, yes, Kevin Spacey's done some pretty terrible things, but it's not fair on Sam Mendes and Alan Ball and Thomas Newman and Codra Earl Hall, everybody else involved. We suddenly tarnish that one film based on the fact that there might be an actor in there in a key role who's done something wrong. I think with directors to the same account over there, like Roman Polanski, his films are not just films that he's made. He doesn't actually write his films. They're usually written by other people. They're produced by other people. They've got different actors and talents involved. So to me, it doesn't make any sense to avoid films based on a filmmaker unless, let's say, everybody involved in the film was a deviant in some sort of way. Otherwise, I think it's just, I don't want to say silly, but I'd say maybe not sensible. Maybe it's not a sensible way of approaching cinema, but to say, okay, this person's got some involvement, so automatically going to involve the contributions of everybody else involved. I just don't see that as a open-minded way to approach cinema at all.
Very interesting answer, Sol. On my part, there's not yet a director or actor I'm actively avoiding. I'm not saying that could never happen for me. It's possible. But I think I share a very similar view to both of you on the subject. Even with someone like Polanski, I will continue to watch their films, and the question is, will I do it at the cinema? Will I watch them when they're on TV? I'm not sure if I've thought too much about the extent to which I may be supporting them financially. And there have been cases where I have actively not supported them financially, such as not going to see them opening in cinema. But yeah, no, there's no actors or directors I'm currently entirely boycotting. But at least for me, there have been a lot of cases where what I have learned about an actor or a director has changed how I see their performances in films or how I see their actual films. So even though this is not as extreme as actively boycotting or avoiding films, are there any directors or actors that what has been revealed about them after has changed how you see them in certain films or see their work?
Well, definitely, yes. I think it's inevitable, right? It's just some knowledge that you're bringing to a film. I'm generally, I guess we can discuss what Saul mentioned earlier, but I generally think that a film is it exists in and of itself after it's been created. And then It's a person watching a film that is meeting with that film, right, and that creates what the film is for that person. And so you are bringing something when you're watching a film. So you are bringing the knowledge that I don't know, Kevin Spacey did some things when you're watching a film with Kevin Spacey now, and that is inevitably going to influence you. In the same way that knowing that Tom Hanks has a reputation for being a super nice guy is also going to influence how you view him in films. And more obviously, perhaps, just the previous films you've seen with that actor, that they also influence it. So, I mean, I think the answer to that is definitely yes. If we are more specifically thinking about people who have done like very bad things, yeah, it definitely has influenced me. But I think it's like anything else, right? There are a countless number of things that influence how you watch a film or interact with any piece of art. And so that's just one of many.
I agree with sort of the idea that films exist in and of themselves and that it's what we bring to them as viewers. So I don't think whether somebody's done something bad or not actually changes the film at all. But viewing it, I think it does, but only for the better. I actually find Polanski's films extremely interesting, and he's one of my favorite directors, not because I think he's a great human being, but because he's had all this persecution, some of it warranted, some of it maybe not, during his lifetime. And you've got these really great paranoia-filled tales because of that. So with any stuff from Polanski, I can see, a bit of himself in there, which makes it extremely interesting for me. But that goes for any director, not just directors who've done the wrong thing. I mean, I think of directors like Catherine Bigelow, and the film Point Break has got some really over-the-top, full frontal female nudity in there. And I'm watching that going, thinking in my mind, going, this is actually really interesting coming from a female director rather than a male director's gaze. So just knowing stuff about the director, whether it's stuff which is positive, negative, or neutral, does influence the way that I watch a film. But I would say only for the better. The more I know about a director and the more I know about their history, what they're like, their cultural background, the more interesting it actually makes it for me to watch a film.
That's a really interesting point, Sol. And I think if you, for instance, look at even recent films, like you hated Jojo Rabbit, didn't you?
No, Jojo Rabbit was one of my top 5 films
Oh,
of
never mind.
2019. I
Sorry.
loved it.
I didn't like it, if it helps.
Oh, okay. So that was a circle. No, but obviously, I think it adds something to know that obviously this is a film where Hitler is portrayed as this lovable imaginary friend through most of it. And it has a lot of jokes around the Nazis, and the child who's endued in Nazi ideology is not treated as evil. And it kind of it's a very human way of looking at what happened in Germany during that time. And I think it's adds a little bit to that to know that Taika Waititi, the director, is half Jewish and both directed, wrote, and starred as the imaginary friend Hitler in it. So I think that there's things that you can learn about the directors or the writers or the actors that do, to an extent, change how you view some of these things and a little bit of how you see some of these things. Even if, like you said, Saul, this information could be good information or just intriguing information. In sense of bad things, absolutely, I think, viewing films with Kevin Spacey now, it's a little bit different. I mean, you can certainly say that the House of Cards character is even more unnerving now than before. And I think to your earlier point too, Matthieu, like nobody knows what's actually happened with Woody Allen, but obviously seeing films where he's interacting with very young women in a romantic way, knowing a lot of the rumors about him, that cannot, at least for me, that can have a little bit, create a little bit of a queasy feeling, no matter what the truth about the matter is, even if it would turn out to be completely innocent of any such wrongdoings. Just knowing that those rumors are about, it can make you quite queasy. So I think it's definitely many times when knowing something about an actor or a director, knowing about the real life and real actions and beliefs just changes something. But how much does it change? That's actually an interesting question too. Like, for instance, knowing that Emil Jannings, who was one of the greatest stars of silent cinema, was a Nazi, like how much does that change about how we enjoy the films? Like, do these things, knowing that Kevin Spacey is very least, a predator, how much does this actually hurt the films they're in for us?
Well, it's not like we can decide, right? I think it just ends up being how we feel. I think it's interesting you mentioned, well, we have talked about Nazis quite a bit. And one example that comes to mind, which is not an example related to the life of an individual person, but it's the Fritz Lang film, Metropolis. Metropolis, it ends with this kind of savior who is kind of bringing together the different parts of the people. And watching it now with historical knowledge, it feels a lot like the message that Hitler was sending, right? Which is not, of course, at all what Metropolis is doing, but it's impossible, at least for me, to watch it without thinking about it.
Well, I think this is actually really interesting too, because Metropolis was Hitler's favorite film. Like that's documented. That's what he said. Like Metropolis was his all-time favorite film. And while Fritz Lang was not a Nazi, he fled the country due to the Nazis. So that part, like from a director perspective, that film should be fine. His ex-wife, who wrote the film, was actually a Nazi. And that's why they divorced as well, because she got endued, like she entered essentially the Nazi zeitgeist. He did not. And then everything went to hell with that marriage, and he ended up in America. But there's clearly, like, if you look at it from the perspective of the writer, there probably were at least inclinations of Nazism in that film. So it's a very interesting film to discuss. And just to be clear, I love Metropolis as well. It's one of my favorite films. So I do share that in common with Adolf Hitler. And I'm sure many film buffs around the world do too. But it's really interesting that you have that. Oh, Soldes did research and says that Hitler's favorite film might actually have been King Kong or Lives of the Bengal Lancers. So in that case, Metropolis may actually stand history slightly better. Thank you, Sol.
Yeah, and I think to get back to something you said, Saul, earlier, you said any knowledge you might have is always going to make the film better. And I guess I'm really puzzled by that. I don't see how that's possible. I guess you really cannot think of a case where even knowledge that is, again, not necessarily related to the personal life of someone, right? Just if you've seen someone in a role 10 times, the 11th time, you're just going to enjoy it a little less, maybe, unless they're doing something interesting with it. I guess just generally, knowledge, it can often enrich us, I agree, but it can sometimes be poison the well. Don't you think?
I don't really think so. I just think it makes it a more dynamic experience because you're looking at different things. And yes, some things might be a bit more creepy, but it's parts that might have just seemed a bit innocent before take on an entirely new meaning. So, yeah, I mean, watching the film might make you feel uncomfortable in different ways, but it actually makes it more of, I can't think of a better word than dynamic. It makes it more of an alive experience rather than just passively watching it. You've got other things that you're taking in and processing it. I guess it just naturally, to me, makes it more interesting. I'm thinking of even like a film called Clown House, which is from director Victor Salva, who was actually prosecuted and was found guilty of kitty fiddling with his young lead actor. And he's got like shots in there where the teenagers, taking his underwear off and everything. And just watching that film with that knowledge in mind, yes, it does make it a bit more creepier, but it also makes it, I mean, to be interesting is the wrong word or whatever. But, I was totally like transfixed, the whole time I was watching Clown House because sort of you're clued in already about what's happened to the director. So you're sort of like looking out for those different things. And you go off ones where directors haven't done bad things, like I sent Catherine Bigelow before, and you just think about other directors who are bringing other things to the table, like directors who might have been secretly gay and stuff like that. When you watch those films, you can pick up on those cues and cues from different actors who might have different things in their past. It just makes it a much more enriching experience for me. I can't say maybe enjoyable. Enjoyable maybe might not be the right word, but I think it's always more enriching for me, and I always get something more out of it the more that I know of the people who are involved, whether it's positive or negative. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
No, that makes complete sense, Saul. And this was actually going to be my ending question for the entire episode. But since you brought it up now, I just say that I full-heartedly agree. And it actually really bothers me that the question of separating art from the artist only seems to come up in terms of actually avoiding artists. Because, like you said, the same concept of whether or not art can be separated from artists, it really does add something to the film. At least for me. I mean, to take to the really extreme example, I think a lot of people have gone to, for instance, Charles Manson's music specifically because of what he did and are finding interesting things in it because of what he did. So they're trying to see, okay, how did someone who did this music do these things? What's the relationship between the art and the artist? And that's a very different process entirely. And I don't think any major filmmaker or star led the homicidal cult. There's probably some similarities to other things, but that's very extreme in a different direction. But it can actually be that knowing about the artist's life, even if it's knowing something terrible or potentially terrible, that adds a different dimension. Knowing those rumors about Woody Allen, for instance, opens us up to read those films in a very different way and see darker elements. And that is actually an interesting discussion in itself. And I remember, Matthieu, that we discussed the latest Roman Polanski film, An Officer and a Spy, or The Accused as it's known in French. And you had a very specific reading on it, that it was essentially an attack on the people criticizing him and how he felt accused. So I think that there's so many other things we can read into films and bring into films that make those films, like Saul said, more alive, more interesting. And I actually think it's a positive to connect the art and the artist and look at their art through that lens. It doesn't need to be the only way we look at their art. I think that there's ways of seeing them separately from the artist as well. But I really just think that there's a lot of extra things we can get from a film if we know more about their lives, even if they were terrible, terrible people. Knowing their actions, knowing their belief systems can make those films more interesting to unpack.
So I don't necessarily agree that knowledge always enriches watching a film, but often it does. And I do think in some ways it is the case for Polanski. Polanski is a director who I generally respect, and I enjoy some of his films, including Rosemary's Baby and Repulsion, which are my two favorites from him, which are films that read very differently when you think about him being guilty of rape. But in the case of J'accuse, the reason I did this, like buying another ticket, is because I think there's a difference between one's individual reaction to a film, which is purely individual, and we can deal with all of that knowledge ourselves, it's fine, and the real life consequences of it. And so Saul mentioned a good point about the consequences on the other people working with Polanski who are innocent in all this, except they chose to work with him, knowing his past, right? Yeah, so it's a question of looking at the real life consequences of your choices. And so I personally did not want to finance Polanski's film, so that's the choice I made. But I think it's a very different question when you're talking about interacting with a piece of art as an individual, where it does not have any consequences for anyone but yourself, really, unless you're like a major critic and your opinion is really influential. In that case, I think it's entirely fine to engage with art coming from anywhere, even the most repulsive places. Like, again, Birth of a Nation, I think, is worth watching. I just think it's a different question when you're talking about promoting things and contributing to them financially.
Yeah, look, I know what you're saying in terms of the fact that these people have chosen to work with Polanski, but they've chosen to work for him for his artistic vision, not because they support what he has done. And okay, well, yeah, that's a bit of a more of a talking point because, J'accuse was made after, the allegations came out. But if we're talking about like films that he's done previously or before the allegations, do we, say, okay, well, look, everybody who was involved in Repulsion or Chinatown or whatever, we're not going to support them either. In terms of buying the ticket and not buying the ticket, it's a really strange way. I mean, I guess if it makes you feel comfortable in yourself that you haven't given a tiny percentage of the ticket sale possibly towards the director or the producers because Polanski didn't produce the film. So I don't even know how much of a percentage he's getting from it. I guess if it's making you or making other people as a viewer feel happier, if they're not contributing a little bit, that's a choice to make. But everything's collaborative in filmmaking. Everything's collaborative. Yes, people can choose who to work with. Just because you're working with somebody doesn't support, things which they did or didn't do. And I think there's just a lot of people who respect his vision, I guess, as a filmmaker. And, I want him to keep making films, not because I like the fact that he might have done something unsavory, but because he makes, the best paranoia thrillers out of everybody out there. And I want him to continue to make films like that because that's the sort of cinema that I'm interested in, not because, I want to finance him to do something which isn't savory. But yeah, look, it's a slippery road. But getting back to the original question over there, which was even if they do terrible things, can they make the film more interesting? I'd say yes, every single case. Even the Victor Salva films, it makes those films more interesting. I think whatever you learn about a filmmaker makes it a more interesting film watching experience.
Yeah, I think we all more or less agree on this then, that knowing what actors or directors believe, even if they were really terrible things, can actually make the films more interesting. I mean, this is there's so many rabbit holes to get into here, but just this is why, for instance, it's really interesting to consume propaganda from various countries, to see social impact of these films. Like you mentioned Birth of a Nation, Matthieu. That's such an interesting film to explore now, as are films from Nazi Germany, where you're both thinking of what are they trying to instill in the population? What are the population getting from them? There's so many additional things that can make even mediocre or terrible films, because a lot of the Nazi films in particular are quite terrible in just how bad the propaganda is, that can just make these really interesting experiences in how we can analyze them and talk about them. From that perspective, I really do think that the artists and the systems they're working within, and just the context around them, can and do matter. Though reading the films just without any of that as well, just as a story, for instance, is obviously completely valid as well. Moving the conversation on a little bit, Matthieu, you mentioned that you already semi-boycott Polanski, at least financially. So I kind of have a half answer on this question from you. But how do we feel about boycotts of specific films, TV shows, etc.? Would you make that choice yourself? And I know that you semi-do. And more importantly, do you understand people who feel that they cannot support or watch something because of what one or more of the people involved in the project have done?
Right. So obviously, I do understand people who do that. I could definitely consider boycotting something for moral, political reasons. I definitely could consider it. Just to expand a bit on the specific case, because it's the only time I've done it. Right. So with that Polanski film, it was also in a context where Polanski is a pretty well-known figure, I guess, in France, and it was a whole public debate around it. And the fact that the film was a financial success was bandied about as being a success for him, right? And then he got César awards, right? It was really hard to separate the art from the artist, right? In this case, because just the general conversation around the film was not doing that. And I think, generally my position is that as an individual watching a film, you can do whatever you want. I think there is you can watch whatever you want and appreciate whatever you want also. But when you're looking at the larger reality, at stuff that has real world consequences, I do have a bit of a different position. I think, again, it's not something that we as individuals have much influence over, but what film is canonical or not. So The Birth of a Nation is the perfect example of that. Is a film that is in any film class about silent film, you would always see that film. And now that's being put into question by many people, because the thing is, when you're not watching that film, you can also watch something else, right? Which might also have values without having some of the issues that film has. And so it gets into the question of a film's historical value as opposed to its aesthetic value. And I mean, I guess that's a whole other kind of words, which maybe we don't have time to open. So I guess to get back to your question, Chris, I think boycotting, I definitely understand it, because I would potentially do it, and have arguably kind of done it already.
I can understand people who want to boycott films. I can definitely understand that. But I think it's a bit short-sighted, and I think that they are personally missing out if they're making not quite snap judgments, but almost snap judgments on what to watch based on what one out of a few hundred people involved in the making of a film has done or may have done. So I can understand it. And with all this cancer cultural crap which is going on at the moment, we're going to cancel different shows based on something being said here or there that might be a bit unsavory. I can understand there's a bit of a climate towards it these days, I guess, in social media or the hashtag Me Too with or people like James Franco missing out on a Best Oscar nomination because it was boycotted against the disaster artist and stuff like that. I can understand it. It's the big thing these days, not wanting to, support in any way and sort of cancel out people who have done things that society doesn't deem to be appropriate or worse. However, I just think the people who do that are just missing out on a whole world of potentially great or even absolutely masterful cinema. And it's just a real shame when it comes down to that. And there's just only one person involved in the whole project, and everybody else is getting boycotted because of that. So I think it's a shame, but I do understand it.
I think some of the things you guys both looked at there, which is, the films that are part of our cinematic canon, how we approach them, what we do about films that are, openly reprehensible, like Birth of a Nation, in this, some of like the Ku Klux Klan are literal heroes of this, essential action summer blockbuster. And also, what we do with artists today, because like you said, interacting with their art and how these stars and directors that are treated off screen is also a completely different debate in many ways, because it's not how we interact with art, but how those people face consequences for their action, and also how that trickles back into the work they do and the people who work with them. And there's so much nuance in that discussion as well, that I think that honestly deserves its entirely own episode. And I think that there's just so much to dive into right there. But to give a slight preview of that potential debate, if we ever do that episode, and to also give my answer too, I do, just be clear, I completely understand people who do want to boycott films and stars, though I also do agree to a point with Saul that they may be losing out. And I agree with Matthieu that there's a big difference between art that was done in the past by filmmakers who are dead and people who are alive and working today and are financially benefiting and maybe actually just escaping what they did and not facing any consequences. It's a very, it's such a very fascinating discussion to have. How far, and again, this is the slight preview of that potential discussion, how far would you go in being understanding of boycotts, or would it reach all the way to censorship or banning certain films, removing films from TV, from the removing songs from the radio, potentially having them, blacklisted? Like, how far would your understanding go here? What's a reasonable or an understandable approach to artists who have done terrible things and their artwork?
Right. So I generally think that definitely censorship is not an answer to that. The answer would be more contextualizing, right? But even then, it's not really the case for stuff like Polanski. I think films by Polanski don't need to be, you don't need to know that Polanski has been convicted actually of rape when you're watching a film. That's not. I don't think you need to know that. It's not as opposed to like The Birth of a Nation, where I think it's a good idea when presenting that film to say, oh yeah, this is a film that was made like basically as a promotion for the Ku Klux Klan, right? So I think it's different in terms of in this question of separating art from the artist. No, I don't think just because an artist has done terrible things that it should be in the way we treat the film institutionally, right? In the way we present it, that it should impact it. So I definitely don't think it should be censored. And I don't even think you should have a card at the start of Rosemary's Baby to say, oh yeah, later he raped someone, right? I don't, I mean, I think that's relevant, but I don't think it's an essential part of what the film is. It's just something that once you know it is part of the film. And in the case of a film like Rosemary's Baby or Repulsion, which are films that deal with hate more or less directly, it can actually enrich us, as you guys mentioned earlier. So yeah, I'm definitely generally against censorship, but I'm not against considering what is put forth as being the exemplary of a period and how we present it, right? There was recently the case of Gone with the Wind, where they added parts to explain, oh yeah, the way Black people are represented in this film was for the period, whatever. I think generally steps like that can be good, right? Because they only enrich the conversation around it, I think, or at least they enrich the people's knowledge of it as opposed to obviously kind of trying to forget about films like that, which I think would definitely be a mistake.
I think we're going off on a slight tangent here because the Gone with the Wind situation is a bit different to separating the art from the artist. With
Yeah,
stuff
you're right.
like Gone, yeah, but look, because it's come up in conversation anyway, with stuff like Gone with the Wind, I don't know if it really needs warnings like that. I don't really see, we're getting suddenly going to have an anti, African American movement starting up just because a few people happened to watch Gone with the Wind and thought slavery was a good idea. I don't think that's likely to happen. I don't think we're giving people in general much credit if we feel we need to write stuff like that at the start of a film and, make it very clear, these things weren't acceptable. I think, yeah, any censorship or whatever, likewise, I'm not in favor of that. I'm not in favor of boycotting, but I can't control what other people want to do. If other people don't want to see a single Polanski film in their life, that's fine. They're going to miss out on tons of great cinema. Same with Woody Allen. Not so much Victor Salva. He's not such a great director, but people can choose what they choose to watch and not to watch. Like some people won't watch horror films because they find them too scary or whatever. People will make choices that I think it's up to them. I don't think it's up to us as a film loving community to make those decisions for them or to put didactic warnings at the beginning of films about filmmakers, about the content of a film. I think we have to give people more credit. Movies aren't as influential as people would like them to believe, just because you see a film that's being a little bit racist, or because you see a film in which maybe kids being molested isn't going to make everybody want to go out there and be a racist or molest kids or whatever. That's just ridiculous thinking. Just because it happens in a film doesn't mean people are going to go out and support it. So no, I think it's actually a bit reverse. Even I'd say it's actually a bit harmful to sort of like have those things at the start of the film and drill in over there. It's let people experience films for what they are.
I think I slightly disagree there, which is that I actually do think that having these title cards that come in front of films, explaining some part of the nature of the film, the filmmaker's life, etc., can be positive, both if the filmmakers did genuinely important things. Like I remember there were flashcards from, for instance, a certain film. I don't remember the name of it right now, but it was a film directed by someone who actually was in a concentration camp, and it was about their experiences, for instance. So things like that can be really interesting to get that additional knowledge about films. I think that contextualizing films can be especially important. In regard to Gone with the Wind debate, I think you're quite right, Saul, that this is a very different debate because we're not actually discussing, same with Birth of Nation, we're not actually discussing the artist behind it. We're discussing the effects of the film, what the films may represent, and it's about the content itself and not the artist. So it's a very different debate. I think that debate should be opened up in a different episode. But I will actually disagree a little bit there too, because if you look at films like Gone with the Wind, I think Adam from New York, for instance, could probably illuminate this a little bit more too. But that's actually become a bit of a white power symbol. I love Gone with the Wind, just to be clear about that. I think it's one of the best films of the 30s. But it's clearly become a symbol for certain, let's say, use that word again, less savory groups. And it's interesting how works are used today and how and just how people react to them. I think that's a very different discussion, but it's definitely a really strong and important debate. So let me just say my opinions on the matter. I'm always entirely against any form of censorship of art. There might be, some elements where art could theoretically enter the criminal realm, but that's never really the case. So in general, I am strongly opposed to any kind of censorship. With boycotts, that's a matter of free speech as far as I'm concerned. I think anyone should be able to boycott anything they want to, and I can be understanding of it. But obviously this is on a case-by-case basis of whether or not I will agree with the boycott. But all of these things are extremely important, extremely nuanced, and extremely complex issues with real life ramifications.
I guess what I'd like to add to that, Chris, is just that, yeah, I'm sorry for kind of derailing us onto the Gone with the Wind thing. You're right that it's another subject entirely. It's related, but it's another subject. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind with this thing is to respect other people's, opinion, to not categorize. I mean, it's maybe obvious to say, but those are the kinds of subjects where it's easy to forget. And so, yeah, I would urge anyone kind of thinking about these subjects to kind of take the time to put themselves another person's shoes and to try to be kinder and more understanding to people. Maybe it's just a general message, but I do think these discussions could stand often to be more pacified.
And with that, I think we've actually covered a large amount of just what we can get out of not separating the art and the artist, but also just allowing for the fact that it is a very difficult thing to do, because we cannot be the arbiter and say, like, you are not allowed to feel awful when you see Kevin Spacey on screen, or feel so queasy with the sight of Bill Cosby due to the large amounts of terrible crimes and rape that you cannot stomach seeing these people. I think that that's not something that is up to anyone to say, but obviously there is the most extreme type of proposition that's been involved here, which is that it actually is immoral to consume art by people who have crossed certain lines. And since this is more dark and more controversial and more bombastic episode, I think we can dive into that as our very final question. So, is there a moral line in consuming art from artists that have done terrible things? And to inflame our comments as much as possible, and just to be clear, all angry messages can be posted at icmforum.com. And because Roman Polanski has been so central in this discussion, let's just go to the most extreme question any of us could really ask in this debate, the question that certain people seem to, or the stance that certain people actually seem to hold, and just ask, is it the case that you could be argued to be supporting statutory rape if you watch a film by Roman Polanski?
Well, when you said that question out loud, I had my microphone mute, but I actually said, "Oh my God," or whatever. When you said that, like totally rolled my eyes in the air. But yeah, look, I think that's absolutely ridiculous to say that you're supporting, statutory rape because you've watched a film in which one out of a few hundred people involved in it has been convicted or possibly or charged with something. I think that's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, you're being intentionally provocative there, Chris. I would not say that, even though I have qualms. I would definitely not say to anyone watching a Polanski film that they're doing anything wrong. I think everyone should make their own choices in accordance to what they believe in, right? And I definitely would not think that someone watching Polanski or whatever, or on another example, right? We've talked a lot about Polanski, but there are a lot of other examples, is explicitly supporting statutory rape. Because, yeah, these questions are, as we've discussed a bit, they're just more complex, right? Just because film is a collaborative medium, because art is not, is not the direct expression with no filter of someone to someone else, right? It's not like a TED talk that Polanski is giving. He's making a film. There's a difference. So yeah, no, I would answer a clear no to that question, even though I do think Polanski's morality is relevant to choosing what films to watch or not.
Yeah, I can't really disagree with that. I do think it is going too far to say that, anyone who watches a film by Roman Polanski in some way, supports statutory rape. Though, like you said before, it could be argued that anyone who actually gives money to Roman Polanski to continue working in the film industry and continue to be popular is in some way giving him a free pass. Would you agree with that more moderate proposition?
I mean, I would. That is how I consider it. But at the same time, I don't think it's that simple either. Right? I think again, Saul's view is a view that I completely understand. A view that is basically to say that Polanski is not the only one, and that you are unfairly punishing other people by espousing that view, right? Because a film is not just one person.
Yeah, I'd say unless it's something like a book that Polanski has written by himself, or you're giving him money to write a speech or to write song lyrics or something where he's only involved in himself, yes, you could say that maybe that's not the best choice of what you do with your money, but otherwise, yeah, I think it's ridiculous to pretend that a film is just the director's work. I mean, auteur theory might be something for another episode, but yeah, a film does not exist just as the director's work.
Oh, and I also have a special announcement for you. We are getting a surprise guest for this episode who has a couple of hard-hitting questions he would like to ask us all. Take it away, Adam.
The more interesting question is, are the people who are like financing the film or working with Polanski condoning what he did rather than putting the focus on the audience?
I mean, yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a whole another kind of worms, but it's also something we really have very little influence over, right? All we can decide is what we do as individuals. So yeah, we can judge people for financing Polanski's films or whatever, but it's not something we actually have any control over.
Well, I suppose that's where the boycotts come in, and the kind of financial disincentivements towards working with people who you find immoral.
So what Adam has just raised there is definitely an interesting point. Even though it's ridiculous to say that you're endorsing it, if you watch a film by them or if you work with them, that's ridiculous to say you're endorsing it. Are you condoning it? Well, I'd say there's a possibility to look at there, but that might be something for another episode.
I mean, it's a very moral question. It's a very philosophical question of, does the fact that you work with someone who's done something terrible mean that you in any way condone that? I don't think so, actually. But I do think that you are, at least I don't think that the people who are working with them think of it that way, to be more precise. But I do think that it certainly means, and this is unquestionable, that these people are willing to overlook the fact that this person did this thing. Now, if that's the same as condoning it, or the same as, following the logic that, this is just one individual among many, or following the principle that, or simply the financial interest that, this is a talented director, he's going to make something that will make money, and he's going to make something that will quite possibly win awards, and that there's no moral stake involved or no moral thought involved. Like, there's so many different things that can be going on in the people's mind, but it's certainly the case that these people are choosing to work with someone who was convicted as a rapist and who did escape as to not serve the rest of his sentence. So it's a very complicated question, and one that maybe we are not the best people to even answer, but it's definitely a can of worm, and a lot of really interesting and nuanced and not so nuanced points could be made about that, and that could possibly be an episode in its own right as well, because there's just so many things to look at there.
Yeah, I don't think we should expect ourselves to find answers to these questions. Just sharing point of views.
I also think there's a big difference between working with someone who's been convicted of something and has like served time in prison and then been released. If you've been convicted of something and served time, then it's a different argument about if you have a right to work or not after that. But I think in the case of Polanski, it's a little bit different in terms of how he fled prosecution. So I think there's a distinction between someone having been convicted and served their time and then maybe being rehabilitated, and someone who avoided facing up to what they did.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, but the Polanski case is extremely complicated.
To get away from Polanski, to have maybe a cleaner example of what Adam was talking about with rehabilitation, there was a French singer who killed his girlfriend, essentially, and went to prison for like 8 years, and then came out, and he was not allowed to reform his group, right? He had to form another group under another name, right? There was a whole legal thing where he could not profit from the name of the group. It was Noir Désir, which was a very famous band in France. And so I guess that's kind of an example of how you can have also legal ways to kind of limit the ways in which people can profit of the fame they have, which is related to the crime. And it's a very complicated issue, but at the same time, they have a right to work. I agree with Adam that if someone has been convicted, has served his time fully, it's a whole very different question than from someone who, from a certain point of view, has not really been punished.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I think that Polanski case is special because he escaped justice, essentially. I mean, I think if he had gone to jail, served his sentence out, and gone back to making films, I think that the backlash would probably have been much, much less than it is. So that's not something I can really focus on. I do also think there's a really big distinction between artists who hold terrible beliefs or done something that itself is not criminal, and people who actually murdered someone and or raped someone, the worst crimes you can imagine. I think that's a very different line as well. And I think it's just so difficult, because I can see many people, including Polanski fans, actually wanting him to serve his sentence and then go back to making films, for instance. Like that's a perfectly plausible stance to have. It's just we're getting into a lot of legal issues here and moral issues here it's just really, really difficult to answer, really. But I would absolutely like to thank Adam for joining in as our surprise guest and co-host, bringing in some really difficult questions before we could let this episode go, because those are the questions that are on everybody's mind, even though we might struggle to give definitive answers to them. It is such a big part of the conversation. I'm sure so many of our listeners have opinions on these cases as well. I mean, if you're a Polanski fan, do you wish that he would actually be sentenced to jail now and serve his time? What are your views on all of this? What's your general stance of any of the issues that we have discussed so far? Is there anywhere where you think that we were just completely off? If you disagree with us on anything, if you agree with us on anything, or if you just want to extend this conversation, bring your own views and stances to this debate, go to icmforum.com, find the topic related to this, and just add your comments there, and we will reply to them, and we can continue this in-depth discussion even more. But until then, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.